Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here today with Philip Bond, Professor of Finance and Business Economics at the University of Washington, to discuss his paper ESG, a Panacea for Market Power, written with Doron Levitt, also Professor of Finance and Business Economics at the University of Washington. And this paper was the winner of the 2024 Intesa Sanpaolo Prize for the best paper in the ECGI Finance Working Paper Series. So, Philip, thanks for joining me. And first of all, many congratulations on your prize-winning paper.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And thanks so much for having me here today.
So we'll only have time to pull out a few key themes from your paper, but perhaps you could begin by explaining the gap it fills in existing scholarship on ESG.
Okay, so there are going to be many exceptions to what I say, of course, but broadly, I would say that the majority of research on ESG type topics are on the relation between the investors, so typically investment funds, and the firm itself. So this is research broadly concerned with the important question of whether funds are able to get firms to do different things, and to the extent to which they are, whether those different things sort of fit with what the funds themselves wanted, and then perhaps more empirically, just the question of whether the investment funds themselves deliver above or below market returns to their ultimate investors. The question we were interested in here is a little different. So we were more interested in imagine that a firm actually imagine that funds succeed in getting the firm to do sort of broadly ESG policies, and we'll be particularly interested in the S dimension, the social dimension of these policies. So this is like treating workers or customers or other stakeholders better than market conditions require. So to the extent to which a firm actually pursues these type of policies, how does that affect what actually happens in the underlying product markets or labor markets, which ultimately are the source of actual sort of economic activity.
Yeah, so let's start with some foundations then. As you mentioned, you focus on the S of ESG and characterize ESG policies as ones that treat employees or consumers better than required by the market. And I think for the purposes of this discussion, we can think in terms of, for example, in paying workers above the market clearing wage. And importantly, you consider the context where firms wield market power. Can you just explain the importance of this condition and what it means for the existence of a trade-off between competition and strength of ESG policies?
Yeah, no, certainly. So this is a great question, and maybe the easiest way to explain this is actually to say a little bit how we started this. So when we first started this, we actually initially thought about the case in which firms don't have market power, where all firms are price takers. And so the starting observation for this research project was that in that case, the one in which firms don't have market power, if some subset of firms then promise to pay their workers more than the market wage, what would happen is that would contract the demand curve for labor. And because it contracts the demand curve for labor, the end result would be that both employment and wages at other firms would actually decrease. So the seemingly benign policy of ESG policies by some firms would lead other workers and other firms to end up being worse off. And this is actually what we call the anti-competitive effect of ESG, still in the paper, because it's working by ESG policy contracting the demand curve for labor. And we would see parallel effects if firms promise to deliver below market prices to customers. So that was really the starting point. But obviously in the world, market power is important, both in product markets and in labor markets. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that not only is market power important, but it's growing over time. So this was a natural case for us to look at. And when we looked at that, we found sort of something else interesting, which was that in the presence of market power, there's also a pro-competitive effect. So perhaps surprisingly, if a firm promises to pay its workers more than market forces alone dictate, a moderate ESG policy of that type will actually lead employment at the ESG firm to rise at the expense of its competitors. So I can say a little bit about why that happens, if that would be interesting. But
yeah, sure, please do. Yeah.
okay, so the underlying reason for this pro-competitive effect arising from really moderate ESG policies is that the way so I have to sort of step a little bit back here. So the way in which a firm exercises market power is to try to pay its workers lower wages. So it's the lower wages that we tend to focus on, but the going hand in hand with paying lower wages is the firm has to make itself smaller than it otherwise would be. So this might sound weird because we're so used to like firms with market power being big, but if they didn't have market power, they'd actually be even bigger, right? Because the thing they're trying to do is they're trying to, with the labor market, hold down wages, or again, sort of analogously in product markets, they're trying to raise prices. So the firm is smaller than it would otherwise be because it's sort of deliberately not hiring quite as much as it would otherwise be to keep wages lower. But if a firm has already promised that it's going to treat its workers well, that incentive to constrain hiring is sort of gone. And so the firm will actually end up hiring more and growing bigger, getting closer to the size it would be without market power. And that's why the ESG promise potentially pushes the firm to be bigger than it otherwise would. And then because it pushes them to be bigger than it otherwise would, that's then acts as a competitive advantage relative to its competitors. Its competitors sort of back off because they understand that the ESG firm is now going to be bigger than it otherwise would be.
Yeah, it's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it? But it's a fascinating result. And you look at the implications of this both for profit maximizing firms under a shareholder primacy paradigm and purposeful firms, as you call them, under a stakeholder paradigm. Right. We'll come back to the latter case, but perhaps just starting with profit maximizing firms, can you expand a little bit more on the implications of your model for both profits and social value when firms adopt ESG policies of different strength?
Yes, certainly. So really so much depends here on exactly the level of ESG policy adopted. So I sort of already ran over some of the key points from aggressive ESG policies in the case I first described, where firms didn't have market power at all. So again, even with market power, an aggressive ESG policy is sort of going to be good for the firm's own workers, but basically bad for everyone else. And because again, the anti-competitive effect is still going to operate. The ESG firms' demand for labor is going to go down, and so wages at other firms will drop. There will also be less employment at other firms because they've sort of grown smaller in response to the ESG firms' own expansion. Industry profits will drop, and typically even industry worker welfare will drop because there's going to be fewer workers. And the workers at other firms are going to be earning less than they otherwise would be. So that's the case for aggressive ESG. The case for moderate ESG is actually much happier. So moderate ESG policies, because they give the ESG firm a competitive advantage, will raise the adopting firm's profits. It will raise wages at the own firm. It will push other firms, will push its competitors to compete up. And so the competitors who aren't necessarily ESG firms themselves will actually have to raise their wages to compete. Total industry employment will rise. The growth of the ESG firm will outweigh the competitive shrinkage at the competitors. It is still the case that profits will fall, but typically worker welfare will go up. So a great deal is at stake in just how aggressive or not the ESG policy is.
And so then a natural consequence of that is that ESG policies themselves become a competitive field. So what do you conclude for how profit maximizing firms will compete and actually explain an interesting consequence that you came to, which was talk of an ESG cycle?
Yes, certainly. So there was I need to start with two results or observations here. So the first is that for the same reasons that an ESG policy gives an ESG firm a competitive advantage, when multiple firms adopt ESG all at once, each firm much prefers to adopt a slightly more aggressive ESG than its competitors, relative to the alternative of simply matching its competitors' ESG policies, or even worse, being slightly outdone by its competitors' ESG policies. So there's a very strong incentive for firms here to just slightly outdo what their competitors are offering in terms of ESG policies. And we think of this as actually very natural and fitting quite well with what we see in the world. So that force is going to push firms to sort of gradually compete up and up and up in ESG policies, right? Because each firm is always trying to sort of slightly outdo what its competitors have done. So there's going to be sort of upwards pressure over time in ESG policies. But at the same time, this can't go on forever. So once ESG policies have become quite aggressive, although it is still the case that each firm would still slightly rather outdo its competitors rather than sort of lag behind. Now there's an even more attractive alternative, which is simply to abandon ESG altogether. Right. And so that's really what gives rise to the cycle. So we think there's going to be, I mean, I should add, this is more conjecture than fully worked out, but we certainly think it's true. So there's going to be a cycle over time where first ESG firms compete up in their ESG policies. At some point, the policy grows so aggressive that firms sort of say, this is too high. I'm just going to abandon this and go back to paying my workers market clearing wages, or again, go back to, in the product market example, in the product market application, go back to sort of charging customers what market conditions dictate.
So as firms sort of break away from the pack, then that creates a reverse cycle where ESG policies come down again, and then you get back to square one and we repeat. So it goes up and down.
Exactly. And now, as far as we can see, the end of the cycle is going to be much quicker than the beginning. We think it's good. Right. We think this is actually going to be sort of slow ramping up over time, but then a rather quick reversal at the end, where the business vibes can change very quickly, so to speak.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's not entirely inconsistent with perhaps what we saw going over the 60s, 70s, 80s, and who knows where we are today. Maybe we're at a turning point today.
That's right. I mean, that's certainly our interpretation. So.
Yeah. I'd like to now turn to the very different and striking implications for purposeful firms. But first of all, it's probably good if you could explain what you mean by a purposeful firm, and in particular, the respective roles of the board and operating managers in such a firm, and then how this leads to really very different conclusions about how such firms select ESG policies.
Okay, so in our language, a purposeful firm is simply one that puts weight on the welfare of its stakeholders in addition to its shareholders. Okay, so the conventional firm is one that just focuses on maximizing shareholder profits. Mm-hmm. A purposeful firm will also consciously worry about the welfare of its workers, its customers, and potentially other stakeholders too. Mm-hmm. And it will look to adopt ESG policies, bearing in mind again not just the effect on shareholders, because as we've already seen, remember that moderate ESG policies actually benefit shareholders also. So we're thinking about a firm that when it adopts an ESG policy, is going to sort of think about the effect of the ESG policy on its workers and customers above and beyond whatever benefit the shareholders already get.
And so what are the different outcomes that leads to then for how purposeful firms manifested this competition between ESG policies?
Okay, so I guess as a preliminary, if a standalone firm, if there's only one ESG firm, right? If only one firm is adopting ESG policies, then qualitatively, it's actually going to look a lot like a shareholder firm, a profit maximizing firm that we've already discussed. So it's going to have the effects of ESG are going to be broadly similar. The firm is naturally going to want to adopt a somewhat more aggressive ESG policy. Like a purposeful firm will naturally adopt a somewhat more aggressive ESG policy than a pure shareholder maximizing firm would, for I think pretty natural reasons. Mm-hmm. But qualitatively, a lot of things are going to look very different. So are going to look very similar, rather. The big difference, which you've sort of pointed to, is when it comes to competition between multiple purposeful ESG firms, and this really goes back to the cycle. So in the cycle that we just talked through, the cycle arises because firms have an incentive to marginally outdo their competitors in terms of ESG policies. But at some point, the ESG policy becomes sufficiently aggressive that each ESG firm would say, look, I'd rather just abandon ESG than stick with this aggressive policy. But for a purposeful firm, which is putting weight on the welfare of, say, its workers, that the abandonment of ESG never happens, right? It doesn't. So even as the ESG policy becomes quite aggressive, the purposeful firm doesn't become tempted to abandon its ESG policy, because abandoning the ESG policy would let it pay lower wages. But this is just a transfer from its shareholders to its workers. And the purposeful firm, because it worries about both workers and shareholders, it doesn't. That's the transfer doesn't really deliver anything. So with competing purposeful firms, the firms again will sort of compete upwards with ESG policies, but then they'll reach a stable level that they won't be tempted to abandon. And the stable level actually is exactly the wage level that we would see if all firms simply competed without market power in the first place.
Hence the name of the title of the paper.
Hence the title of the
ESG,
paper.
a panacea for market power. And I mean, and this finding that competition on ESG policies between purposeful firms, the finding that it fixes market power distortions and optimizes social welfare, is very, very striking. So should we all be stakeholder capitalists now, or are there limitations to the conclusions? For example, what happens if purposeful and profit maximizing firms are both present?
Okay, so I'll come to the case where they're both present in just a second. One interesting thing, even when all firms are purposeful, is whether competition between purposeful firms delivers this happy conclusion depends a little bit on exactly the tools that purposeful firms have at their disposal. So all through the paper, the case we look at is an ESG policy for a firm in our world is a promise to treat stakeholders better than market conditions require. And we adopted this modeling device because we actually think this is what ESG policies are in the world. But to be fair, it is possible to imagine other policies. So you could, for example, imagine firms committing to certain employment levels or certain output levels in the product markets. And although these types of commitments look harder, and I would argue we see them much less than the ESG policies that we characterize, they are things that you might imagine being possible in the future. And if firms were to compete in these kind of alternative policies, then they actually tend to grow too large when purposeful firms compete. And so they'll actually so remember, market power means trying to pay your workers less and accepting that you're going to be smaller as a consequence. But purposeful firms competing with say employment level promises will actually grow too large relative to the social optimum. And that what is too large sounds counterintuitive. What does too large mean? It means that the extra welfare they're delivering to workers is too small relative to the cost to shareholder profits. Okay. So that's maybe the first caveat I would know. The other sort of scenario you asked about, where purposeful and profit maximizing firms compete. So we haven't sort of pursued this so formally. To some extent, this is, we've thought about this a bit, but to some extent, this will, I think, have to be a topic for future research. As far as we can see, the profit maximizing firm is going to end up, unsurprisingly perhaps, with higher profits than the purposeful firm. So in that sort of world, the purposeful firm, the stakeholder capitalist firm, is going to face, we think, continuous takeover pressure from subsets, from categories of shareholders who may care much less about stakeholder welfare. They'll always be looking at these stakeholder firms as an attractive takeover target. And so then the question becomes, how will the takeover market operate? So we're going to have a situation now where there's a stakeholder firm or a stakeholder capitalist firm, presumably owned largely by shareholders who are themselves like stakeholder capitalists. They're shareholders who attach real value to stakeholder welfare. And then these shareholders will receive potentially an attractive takeover offer, which is where they're going to the takeover offer is going to be one where the tender offer exceeds the current market price of the shares. And then the question becomes, do these stakeholder capitalist shareholders, do they accept the offer or not?
Yeah, okay.
And that's actually a question that we've ended up pursuing also in ongoing research. And we think, it's somewhat separate, and our current research project is actually thinking about this both in the context of our existing work, but also expanding to think about sort of environmental externalities in that ongoing research.
That's fascinating. As you say, the preferences of investors are going to be crucial in determining the outcome in that model. That's extremely interesting. So, I mean, just to finish, at the end of your paper, you highlight 11 empirical predictions of your theory. Are there a couple of favorites that you've got that we haven't discussed yet?
Okay, I mean, maybe the thing I would pull out most, because I think it's actually quite important for empirical work, is that in general we predict that when some firms are ESG firms and some firms aren't, the ESG firms are naturally going to pick a policy that means that in equilibrium, in the equilibrium of, say, the labor market, all firms are going to end up paying the same. So again, just to say quickly why that's happening. So again, the ESG firm promises to pay its workers more. The ESG firm grows bigger, its competitors grow smaller, but its competitors also have to sort of bid up their own wages. If the ESG policy is very aggressive, the other firms don't bid up their wages all the way. But if the ESG policy is somewhat moderate, then the other firms fully bid up their own wages to match the ESG firm. And so it's going to, if we can look at the world, it's going to be very tempting to conclude that the ESG policy actually isn't doing anything at all, right? We'll look at the world and we'll see one firm that says it's the ESG firm and other firms that make no such claims. And we'll be tempted to draw the incorrect conclusion that the ESG firm is just like using empty words and really it's not doing anything at all. But that's very far from the truth. Like, everyone's wages are higher in this world because the ESG firm exists. So I think if I had to single out as one thing, I think it would be that.
Right. That's very, very, very interesting and topical. Yeah. Well, Philip, thanks so much. Again, congratulations on your prize-winning paper. That was a fascinating discussion.
Okay, well, thanks so much.